You'd think that these iconic American restaurant chains are too big to fail, but they almost did. Chuck E. Cheese was the destination for arcade games and kids' parties, but it eventually went bankrupt. TGI Fridays went from one of the hottest singles bars in town to a failing chain. And even fast food giant Subway was at one point closing more stores than it was opening. So, what went wrong? Let's start with Subway. With its 37,000 locations worldwide, it's undoubtedly a fast food giant. But in recent years, Subway has been on a roller coaster ride. So where did it all start? And what happened?
The chain began as Pete's Super Submarines in Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1965. 3 years later, co-founders Fred DeLuca and Peter Buck rebranded it to simply Subway.
Subway's famous giant foot-long sandwiches are made right before your eyes, the way you want them.
What was so compelling then, and still is today about Subway, is really an open kitchen format. In many ways, they really pioneered that, and the ability to customize your sandwich.
The brand redefined fast food with fresh ingredients that customers could see. Compared to other fast food chains at the time, it felt healthy. And it worked. By 1981, there were 200 locations across the US, and soon after, Subway went international.
In the late 70s and in the 80s and in the 90s, everyone knew about Subway. I mean, they were everywhere, they're still everywhere.
That's Joel Labava, an expert in franchising. While each store looks and smells the same, they're all independently owned franchises.
The format is pretty simple. You buy a franchise, you get trained, they help you secure a location, they help with a grand opening, and you're open. You're open for business. Follow the several hundred-page operating manual, do the advertising, and customers will come in.
Not only were Subway franchises successful, they were and still are one of the cheapest chains to franchise. While the max cost to open a Subway franchise is $525,000, opening a McDonald's can cost more than $2.4 million. Because Subways were easy to open, the number of stores skyrocketed. Between 1990 and 1998, store locations rose from 5,000 to over 13,000.
And in that same period of time, gross sales rose by about $2.1 billion. Subway's success continued into the early 2000s. At a time when obesity was rising rapidly in America, Subway continued to market itself as a healthy alternative to fast food.
One of their biggest successes for sure was the Jared Fogle story. Everyone remembers those ads where it's him in those huge pants where he's showing how he lost all of this weight. And that just made them so much money, and it really made people think about Subway as a really great health brand. It was one of the biggest advertising wins that any chains had in recent decades. So that was a huge, huge part of their brand.
Subway carried Fogle's success story for nearly a decade. But by 2008, the world was suffering from the effects of the Great Recession. And for many Americans, hunting for deals replaced the obsession with weight loss. So Subway changed up its message. In March 2008, it introduced a new promotion that would come to define the chain. By August 2009, as other restaurant chains were struggling through the recession, the $5 footlong had pulled in $3.8 billion in sales for Subway, a 17% jump in U.S. sales from the year before. But even the best deals run their course. Starting in 2014, Subway sales began steadily dropping. Behind the scenes, many of the reasons for Subway's success had turned on them. Quiznos was once Subway's main competition, but tons of subchains like Jimmy John's, Firehouse, Potbelly, and Jersey Mike's, and fast casual chains like Panera were offering seemingly fresher and healthier options. And they started stealing market share.
They're competing against people who bring in fresh produce every day. A lot of Subway locations only bring in fresh produce once or twice a week.
On top of that, fast food chains that had been around as long as Subway were coming up with healthy alternatives of their own and getting creative with new menus.
More and more fast food chains really want to have that innovation pipeline where they're bringing something out new almost every month. Fast food places are looking for ways to bring in new customers, drive traffic, and Subway has not tried to do that in the same way other places have.
But other fast food chains weren't the only competition for Subway franchises. With Subway's franchising model making it so easy to open locations, stores inevitably started opening up around the corner from each other in lucrative markets. Take downtown Manhattan, for example. Within a 15-minute walk and less than half a square mile, there are 10 Subway locations. And these locations in close proximity began cannibalizing each other's sales.
The Subway franchise agreement, the contract, it says they can open anywhere. There is no protected territory. So franchisees really have no say-so in where the other franchisees are going to open. It's a problem.
And Subway corporate wasn't stopping it, because the company benefited from a high number of locations. More locations meant more franchising fees, and high royalties to Subway corporate, which diminished the effect of falling sales from a single location.
When franchisees' sales are kind of slipping, as long as they're staying open, it doesn't necessarily hurt Subway as much as it would some other chains. If everyone's kind of like chugging along, like opening new locations, then they can kind of keep on keeping on, and it's not going to be the end of the world for the corporate office.
Franchise owners, on the other hand, took the hit. In 2012, each Subway franchise generated an average of $482,000 a year. 4 years later, that number had slipped to $422,000 a year. For comparison, the average annual revenue of a McDonald's franchise in 2016 was $2.6 million. And to make matters worse, Subway would lose the face of its company. In 2015, the man who had embodied Subway's Eat Fresh mission was charged with possession of child pornography and having sex with minors. Subway cut ties with Fogel, and he was sentenced to 15.5 years in federal prison.
And the Jared Fogle thing kind of basically went from a huge positive to a huge liability, like the worst things possible that your brand could be associated with.
All of these things created the perfect storm for Subway, and soon locations started to close. In 2016, Subway closed 359 stores in the US. It was the first year the chain closed more locations than it opened. In 2017, that number was over 800, and by the end of 2018, over 1,000 locations had closed. With all these sour ingredients, it's hard to imagine Subway could bounce back. But the chain is certainly trying.
In 2017, Subway rolled out a redesign called Fresh Forward. The revamped restaurants featured touchscreen ordering, Wi-Fi, USB plugs, new furniture, and music. The menu also got a facelift. In 2018, the chain introduced its cheesy garlic bread, the most successful new item in the last 5 years. And in 2019, a line of ciabatta sandwiches and Halo Top milkshakes hit stores. The changes seem to be working. After years of store closures, in the first half of 2023, Subway recorded a roughly 10% rise in global sales at its restaurants, and a similar rise in online delivery sales. After having grown too big, too fast, the sandwich giant now seems to be well on the road to recovery.
Chuck E. Cheese, when you're hungry for fun, it's Chuck E. Cheese.
Chuck E. Cheese is another iconic American brand, hoping for a change in fortune. At one point, the restaurant chain was synonymous with children's birthday parties.
When my mom asked me where to go for my birthday, I said Chuck E. Cheese's.
They came for the pizza, arcade games, and this guy.
People love the rat.
And for decades, it worked. But over time, the fun began to fade, and Chuck E. Cheese declared bankruptcy in June 2020. So, what happened? And where is it now?
Nolan Bushnell, the co-founder of the video game company Atari, came up with the idea for Chuck E. Cheese. He felt there was something lacking in restaurants. He once told Fast Company, "I wanted to add a dimension of fun to the act of having a meal." So he put video games into a restaurant. And he served pizza, so while customers waited for their pies, they could play arcade games.
He is not someone who is coming from this from a pizza angle. He's like, okay, I know video games, and I think that I can bring animatronics into the world of pizza, which is kind of a crazy idea, but clearly it has worked over the years.
Originally, Bushnell planned to name the restaurant Coyote Pizza, so he ordered what he thought was a coyote costume for his lead animatronic. It turned out to be a rat, and Bushnell decided to run with it. First, he thought of changing the restaurant's name to Rick Rat's Pizza, but his team convinced him that having rat in a restaurant's name wasn't the best idea, so they agreed on calling the mascot Chuck.
Chuck E. Cheese was originally almost more geared towards adults. He smoked a cigar, he had a Jersey accent. It was kind of like an adult night out.
Like, happy birthday to you, you get it?
But pretty quickly, it became clear that kids are the ones who actually enjoy being around animatronic animals.
And thus, Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater was born, with the rat mascot front and center. The first restaurant opened up in 1977 in San Jose, California, and the concept blew up, thanks to three things. Chuck E. Cheese's could fit over 400 guests, way more than any other pizzerias, and the 20-minute window waiting for pizza was a goldmine for the arcade. They could lure people in with a few free tokens with each meal. People would stay, popping in quarter after quarter into those 75 arcade games.
Restaurants tend to be low-margin businesses, and those games are very profitable.
Those games accounted for 40 to 50% of Chuck E. Cheese's restaurant profits.
The iconic Chuck E. Cheese tokens, that's where people are spending most of their money, to get the tokens, to play the arcade games, to kind of have this party experience, not so much on pizza.
Now, before Chuck E. Cheese even launched, Bushnell sold Atari, including the Chuck E. Cheese concept, to Warner Communications in 1976. So in '78, Bushnell bought back Chuck E. Cheese for $500,000, and he quickly expanded into new locations. Then things got a little complicated. Chuck E. Cheese's success caught the attention of businessman Robert Brock, and he signed on to franchise more than 200 locations. But that same year, Brock ended up canceling the deal, finding an engineer for animatronics and launching a family restaurant chain of his own. He called it Showbiz Pizza.
The concept was pretty much the same. It was different characters, but the same kind of like pizza, arcade games.
And while Chuck E. Cheese's had been growing alongside the blossoming gaming industry, through the early 80s it found itself in a bitter battle with copycat Showbiz.
There was definitely a rivalry between the two at the time.
And Showbiz had arguably better animatronics. Chuck and his friends were limited to frames on the wall. Showbiz had an entire band called Rockafire Explosion, made of full body characters. By 1981, Showbiz locations were raking in nearly $1.5 million in revenue, outperforming Chuck E. Cheese's by $260,000 per store. But Chuck E. Cheese still had more locations, and was still outpacing Pizza Hut and McDonald's at the time. So that year, Bushnell took Chuck E. Cheese's public. But there were problems looming on the horizon. Chuck E. Cheese's was no longer the best arcade, and it definitely wasn't the best pizza restaurant. As the market became crowded, novelty wore off, and things turned sour. To try and outpace Showbiz, Bushnell expanded faster and faster, opening a new location every 5 days and driving the company into debt. Then came the video game industry crash of 1983. As people turned to computer games, consoles and arcades were hit hard. Video game sales dropped 97% nationally, and arcades closed across the country. It wasn't a great time to have a restaurant centered on arcade games. That year, Chuck E. Cheese's losses reportedly totaled $15 million. And a year later, Chuck E. Cheese's declared bankruptcy. But its rival Showbiz? Well, that company weathered the crash a little better. And in a wild twist, Showbiz ended up buying Chuck E. Cheese for $35 million. The copycat had bested the original. But the acquisition breathed some life back into Chuck E. Cheese. By the early 90s, all the Showbiz restaurants were transformed into Chuck E. Cheese's.
For some reason, Chuck E. Cheese, the mascot, really did have staying power. People loved the rat.
And those better animatronics over at Showbiz got a new life too. The Rockafire Explosion Band was stripped of its costumes and replaced with Chuck E. Cheese and crew.
The fact that Chuck E. Cheese died and then was reborn in a new company is just very bizarre.
Fast forward to 1998, and Chuck got a little bit of a makeover. The parent company dropped the name Showbiz for CEC Entertainment. By 2000, there were 300 locations, and the company was steadily growing.
I would say the 90s, the early 2000s, Chuck E. Cheese was really thriving. That's when people my age, I think, have the memories of childhood, the really nostalgic memories. The best era for Chuck E. Cheese, really.
This renaissance didn't last long. 12 years later, even though locations continued to open up, they'd hit another sales slump. So again, Chucky the Rat was rebranded, this time as a rock star mouse, with a backstory. According to the company's website, Charles Entertainment Cheese is an orphan who celebrates others' birthdays to make up for his tough childhood. The new mouse came alongside an option of gluten-free pizza. 2 years later, despite slumping sales, private equity firm Apollo Global Management saw an opportunity. Chuck E. Cheese still had brand recognition and locations across the globe.
Restaurants tend to have a short life cycle. What's nice here is children age out and new children come in. So that gives the business, or gave the business, a certain degree of resilience.
Private equity firms, they approach the owners with an idea that like, hey, we're going to expand this business. We're going to bring it to overseas, to other countries. And so that's attractive.
Apollo acquired Chuck E. Cheese Entertainment in a leveraged buyout for about $1 billion. In a leveraged buyout, private equity firms purchase a company with partly their own money and partly borrowed money. That turns into debt the company is responsible for paying. Ultimately, the acquisition saddled Chuck E. Cheese with nearly $1 billion in debt.
It was quite a bit of debt for a company like Chuck E. Cheese.
Chuck E. Cheese already had a lot of expenses. Monthly rent on all of its locations, pricey arcade games, and animatronics to maintain. To try and keep up with debt payments, Chuck E. Cheese tried revamping again. It retired its famous animatronics, added an interactive dance floor, redesigned the restaurant, and replaced the iconic gold tokens with a Play Pass card. But operating income had slowly been declining. A 2019 planned reverse merger was going to help them with their debt load, but it didn't come through. Things only got worse when famous YouTuber Shane Dawson posted a video circulating decades-old rumors that Chuck E. Cheese recycled pizza.
Chuck E. Cheese definitely denied that they're recycling their pizza. However, the pictures make it look like they do.
Despite the company's insistence of zero pizza foul play, the damage to Chuck E. Cheese's reputation had been done. Then, as we all know, in 2020, the coronavirus pandemic hit, forcing Chuck E. Cheese to close down locations for dine-in in March.
When you can't have kids in for parties, that is kind of their bread and butter, and that's always been their bread and butter.
By June, only about half of the nearly 560 locations had reopened for dine-in, delivery, or takeout. Sales declined by 94% during the last 2 weeks in March, and 21% overall in the first quarter, and the company was forced to furlough 65% of its support staff and the majority of hourly employees. By June 25th, the parent company had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, with nearly $2 billion in debt. An announcement of 34 permanent store closures soon followed.
The whole purpose of a Chapter 11 bankruptcy is to try to protect the integrity of the business while getting rid of the large amounts of debt that put the company to bankruptcy to begin with.
By the end of 2020, the company said it had successfully offloaded $705 million worth of debt. It still has nearly 500 locations in the US, and since the restructure, Chuck E. Cheese has looked to expand the brand globally. But the restaurant's iconic cast of characters, Munch's make-believe band, won't be along for the ride. In November 2023, the company announced it would be retiring the animatronic bands in all of its locations except one, in a suburb of LA. But even though he may be missing some friends, it seems Chuck E. Cheese is here to stay.
When you hear TGI Fridays, perhaps you think of family meals and colorful cocktails. But the chain started out by riding the wave of the sexual revolution in the 1960s as one of the first singles bars in the US.
My favorite line was, "Hi, darling, I own this place." And it worked every time.
But as Fridays became a family restaurant, it struggled against the competition and began shuttering restaurants after the 2008 financial crisis. So how did TGI Fridays go from the hottest spot in town to a diner in decline? When Alan Stillman opened his first bar in 1965, he was thinking about one thing.
My business plan was to meet a lot of women. It's a hell of a business plan, I'll tell you that.
Back then, women rarely went out drinking in public. It was even banned in some places.
Women didn't have a lot of the rights. I mean, you couldn't have your own credit card. Everything had to be, under the aegis of a man. You had to be connected to a male figure.
But things were changing, fast.
Out of the Vietnam War protests and out of the civil rights movements, there was a women's liberation movement.
A new movement for women's liberation is launched.
Cities were increasingly full of working women looking to spend time with their friends, or find a date, just like Stillman. So he came up with a simple concept, a cocktail party that anyone could attend. Stillman redecorated an old bar on the corner of 1st Avenue and 63rd Street in Manhattan, with Tiffany lamps, ferns, and bentwood chairs. The waitstaff dressed in red and white stripes, and his concept was to create a space where women could feel welcome.
The word singles bar was not invented, and I certainly didn't think that I was inventing anything like that whatsoever.
Stillman's plan to find a date had worked. Not only for him, but for single people all over New York. In 1970, a TGI Fridays opened in Memphis, this time as a franchise, and 4 more franchises followed soon after.
So I saw that, and I'd always vowed that after 10 years of corporate life, I was going to be an entrepreneur, and this looked like a good opportunity.
This is Dan Scogan. He signed a deal with Stillman to launch 8 new locations, starting with Dallas.
Little did I know that this decision would have me in a Volkswagen bus with a beard and bell-bottom pants and going around and buying antiques.
Until 1971, selling anything besides beer or wine at a bar in Dallas had been illegal for more than 5 decades, even after Prohibition ended.
And Prohibition is repealed.
But things were about to change.
We wanted to upscale what Alan had been doing.
When Scogan's TGI Fridays opened in 1972, it had phone booths, outdoor patios, and a raised square bar.
You had patrons at a bar, and then there was this teeny narrow passageway. The bodies were all smushed up together very deliberately, and that was a huge hit.
And we opened at 30% profit, which was over 3 times the best that any Fridays had ever done.
Scogan introduced strawberry daiquiris and other frozen cocktails, a new kind of drinks menu designed to appeal to women.
We would go every night and see what guys we could pick up at the bar. We were usually very successful because we were young and cute way back when. And I actually met my husband there.
We still wanted to be the best bar in town. And so all of our bartenders had to be able to free pour better than a machine could do it. And they had to be the most friendly, outgoing, wonderful people that you could ever buy a drink from.
I'd start doing the trick and then stop, make some drinks. So then you and the people you didn't know beside you would start talking. Oh, what are they doing? Now you're making friends. We were the biggest show in town. People would line up outside. We'd have to rope off the bar. We'd have to let people out to let people in.
But eventually, the lines began to dwindle.
Unfortunately, the singles bar thing ended. It was all of a sudden, and it caught me by surprise.
So Scogan decided to pay more attention to food.
We expanded the menu quite a bit. I mean, there were a lot of products in there. And that was our first step into being a restaurant, not just a bar.
Favorites like loaded potato skins were added to the menu.
He's going neutral territory, guys.
TGI Fridays was making a comeback as a pioneer of family dining.
Welcome to Fridays, come on in.
In 1975, Scogan and his partners sold the company to the Carlson Group. Stillman left the business and eventually went on to create Smith & Wollensky, the famous steakhouse. Scogan stayed on as CEO.
We went to work on a strategy of becoming an impulse buy, an alternative to eating at home.
A new category of restaurants was on the rise: casual family dining. In the 1970s and early 80s, chains like Ruby Tuesday, Chili's, Applebee's, and Olive Garden entered an increasingly crowded market. TGI Fridays tried hard to stay ahead of the curve. In 1983, Carlson decided to take the chain public. Menus changed every season. TGI Fridays came up with a kids menu, and non-alcoholic drinks debuted in 1983. By the time Fridays turned 20 in 1985, there were more than 100 locations across the US. And the focal point of every restaurant, the bar, had become part of popular culture. Flair bartending, as it was called, reached a whole new level. TGI Fridays went on to launch its own world championship. Alan Stillman even claims that Tom Cruise's character in Cocktail was based on him.
You gotta sit in the water, go to Coney Island.
But for Scogan, growth came at a price.
Because of the rapid growth, we were having stores that were problematic. It was all because it just expanded way too rapidly.
Scogan left in 1986, and 3 years later, Carlson Companies bought out all the shareholders to take the chain private again and make a major push to expand.
I was at the end of my contract. He wanted me to stay on and do the international thing, and I said, no, I've got this boat, I've got to go get on and take my family and leave.
By the mid-1990s, almost every state had at least one TGI Fridays, and the brand had gone international. There was even a location at the US Air Base in Afghanistan. Over time, TGI Fridays introduced a low-carb menu and toned down the decor.
At TGI Fridays, we let our chefs flex their muscles, and we have a whole new menu to show for it.
But in spite of high ad spending, Fridays struggled to stand out.
Fridays was not distinguishing itself from the competition. A Fridays felt like an Applebee's, for an example, or an Applebee's felt like a Chili's.
They were all sort of working off of the same playbook in many ways.
In 2008, TGI Fridays had more than 600 restaurants in the US. But sales started to dip as the financial crisis gripped the restaurant industry.
You started to see the rise of this new segment called fast casual. They were now starting to offer extremely high quality meals, and they were doing it cheaper, they were doing it faster, they were doing it where you didn't have to wait at your table, you didn't have to tip.
Between 2008 and 2019, Fridays closed more than 200 restaurants in the US. Sales also crashed. In 2020, plans to take TGI Fridays public once again were pulled as the pandemic rocked the industry.
When a company is planning on going public and then does not go public, that's usually not a great sign.
During the pandemic, TGI Fridays closed more than 74 of its 386 restaurants in the US.
People wanted things delivered to their homes. The pandemic really supercharged that.
But all is not lost for casual dining chains.
It's very premature to write off casual dining. The growth that casual dining has seen during 2021 has been nothing short of remarkable.
TGI Fridays still has more than 700 restaurants around the world, and its focus on delivery started to pay off. In 2022, sales in the US increased to 8% compared to pre-pandemic levels. But 2023 was a big year for Fridays, with constant shakeups at the top. CEO Ray Blanchett stepped down in May 2023, and his successor, Brandon Coleman, only lasted 2 months. He was replaced by longtime board member Weldon Spangler, who the company says will expand the company's global footprint. Returning to its roots, the company is hopeful it can bring back some of that lost Friday feeling. Applebee's was once the go-to destination for family nights out, but in the last 6 years, Applebee's has closed nearly 300 stores, and rising development costs have prevented the company from opening new ones. To turn its fortunes around, Applebee's has brought back its $1 margarita deal, the Dollarita. But will that be enough to see people once again eating good in the neighborhood?
Bill and TJ Palmer opened the first Applebee's in 1980. 3 years later, they sold the restaurant concept to W.R. Grayson Company, and it quickly blew up. By 1994, there were more than 500 Applebee's locations across the US. And just 4 years later, in 1998, the company opened its 1,000th restaurant, rivaling competitor store locations like IHOP with 800 and Denny's with more than 1,000 stores nationwide.
Applebee's was really doing well because they were reliable. They weren't too fancy, they weren't too cheap, but they hit a nice sweet spot in the middle for people.
Dishes like Applebee's boneless buffalo wings became a fan favorite, and promotions like half-priced appetizers made Applebee's a popular spot for customers looking for a good deal. But then, at the end of 2007, the recession happened, and people stopped eating out as much.
We are in a recession.
The longest recession since World War II.
But the question now, when will it end?
As Applebee's sales struggled in the post-recession economy, it attempted to reinvent itself as a modern bar and grill to draw in up-and-coming millennials. But it didn't work.
Applebee's tried to be a little bit trendy, a little bit cool, and it just came off as kind of corny for most people, where it felt like they were trying too hard to win over millennials.
New menu items like hand-cut $20 steaks and brisket nachos not only failed to bring in new millennial diners, they alienated the very customers who had made Applebee's successful in the first place. People looking for a reliable, affordable meal out. By 2015, Applebee's sales were falling and only continued to fall year after year. In 2017, The company closed 99 locations. Julia Stewart, the CEO of Applebee's parent company, Dine Brands Global, reportedly stepped down because of Applebee's poor performance. The former waitress was one of the industry's most celebrated and longest-serving executives. For a brief time, it looked like Applebee's was done for. But instead of folding, it turned things around.
Starting in late 2017, 2018, Applebee's parent company, Dine Brands, had new leadership come in, and this new leadership was very, very focused on being inexpensive and not trying to be too trendy. Basically, they took Applebee's back to the basics. They're not gonna try and win over millennials with these fancy new menu items. They're gonna find something that's inexpensive that people are proven to like. The biggest thing that kind of kicked off the turnaround for Applebee's was the Dollarita, the $1 margarita.
After the success of the Dollarita, Applebee's quickly launched its neighborhood drink program, releasing a new $1 and $3 drink every month. Alcohol deals helped Applebee's stay strong during the pandemic, as off-site sales rose from 13% to over 40% in 2021. Applebee's says it's now achieving the same in-store customer numbers it did pre-pandemic. And with the Dollarita making a return, parent company Dine Brands is hoping for a return to the good times for the neighborhood grill.